generation sources, the changing environment, whether we're talking about environment of the type of power, the environment as far as climate adaptation. And so this next session really looks at what are we doing with, or what is the impact of renewable energy integration? What is it doing to our grid, our systems? How is it working? Who are the players? And so today we have three great presenters from different perspectives to be able to share with you their thoughts on this key issue of how renewables are working on our grid, on our current infrastructure and that future infrastructure. And our first speaker is Joann with Voltus. We have Jason with Evergy, and Cathey on his first at bat. He was kind enough to bat twice for us today. From SPP will be the presenters today. So with that, Joann, I'll let you.
Okay. So this is the clicker. Okay, excellent. Okay, good afternoon. My name is obviously Joann. As he just said, Joann Worthington. I'm with Voltus. Yep. Let's see. And I wanted to talk to you today about virtual power plants and how important they can be in the near term in integrating variable resources, which is a part of the energy transition that we've all heard us talk about over the last few years. I'll start by telling you a little bit about me, a little bit about Voltus, and then we'll talk about virtual power plants as a key to the energy transition. I started at Voltus in May of last year, so this is a little bit of a new career shift for me. I was a regulatory counsel at AEP for 15 years prior to doing that. And a part of a lot of their, Mr. Spire talked about the efforts that Ameren and Evergy were making on power plant acquisitions or building. And I was a part of some of those as well. In Oklahoma, there was a statute. Some states, there's a CCM process. In Oklahoma, there was a statute where you asked for pre-approval. And they had some very large publicized cases on their transition to renewable resources and the investments required for those. And a lot of the questions came up that are extant right now. I kind of done for all the lawyers in the room. I did the circuit. I worked for a firm, and then I worked for the government, the AG's office, and then private corporations. So I'm doing sort of the lawyer circuit. About Voltus, they're a distributed energy resources platform, and essentially what they do is sort of provide the suite of services that behind the meter resources need to participate in wholesale markets. So the difference between that and like retail sort of participation is we are directly aggregating these resources into a portfolio of resources, and they are being bid into RTO or ISO markets and getting paid analogous revenues that a supply side generator would be paid, whatever the price is at a particular node, or or whatever capacity credits, if that's that market's construct. We participate in all the wholesale markets, capacity, energy, ancillary services, and that's the sort of value we bring to customers and to the grid. It's a great resource for balancing the grid or providing low-cost wholesale supplies. Actually, it's almost like reverse supply, but customers either having their own behind-the-meter generation, VRs, or curtailment, demand response, that not using, that then ameliorates the need to power up a traditional generator. Oops, sorry. We are the only distributed resources platform that's in all 9 North American power markets. And we were named by Wood Mackenzie as a BPP leader in several categories. One of the big ones is we have the highest number of virtual power plants that include commercial industrial customers. We are the biggest that is not a thermostat provider. Essentially, that the other bigger ones have a lot of residential, behind the meter thermostats or EVs. And so they're bigger just because of the volume that they have. But when you exclude those, we're the biggest. And we're the only aggregator delivering into SPP currently. So what is a virtual power plant? Basically decentralized resources that you essentially connect or aggregate, and you can generate, store, manage electricity, all those services that we talked about before: capacity, energy, ancillary services. So virtual power plants, I'm not pushing the button. Virtual power plants versus traditional power plants, they all have their benefits, and you can see where they overlap. But I think one of the things about virtual power plants that makes it an ideal solution in the short and near term is that they work really well with renewables, but they can scale and adjust quickly, and then they balance over and underperforming resources to really achieve the solution that an RTO needs at that time. So, you know, we don't have to wait for a power plant to be constructed. These things are out there now, they're operating now, they're on people's homes and businesses now, or they're available to curtail now. And so it's a good bridge as all those battles are being fought over new generation, and policymakers grapple with, you know, how quick the transition should or shouldn't be happening. In the meantime, these are the things that we need to be doing. And there's not like this single point of failure, I think, is the other key attribute of virtual power plants. I do agree with Mr. Jansen's fire that they are dispatchable, and that's important. But in winter storms, there can be issues where a gas plant may not be able to come online or stay online, and so you still need a further backup for those sort of resources. You know, during Uri, and I had AP during Uri, you know, all of the traditional generation had different challenges. Coal piles were freezing, so that was the issue with the coal generation. And then gas facilities would sort of freeze when the temperature got low enough. And then the problems that he talked about with actual supply. If you had a firm transportation agreement, you may or may not, because they might declare force majeure. And even if you had firm transportation, and even if they did not call a force majeure, the prices were so exorbitant, and you knew you were going to have to go back to your regulator and explain all of that. So it would be nice to have some other options that could be pursued. BPPs provide routine and emergency capacity to the utilities and grid operators. And there's different ways that different states are pursuing this different ways. We, as a platform, obviously prefer to work directly with customers and bid them in directly to customers, because we have that expertise and we have a whole platform and a system that manages that complexity for the utilities and for the customers. But in some states, they work directly with utilities and work through a tariff of theirs, and that's another option. Demand response is one of the biggest resources that we aggregate, which is essentially conserving or shifting. Using a lot of utilities have retail demand response, and those operate a little bit differently in that, you know, they usually put some sort of measure in place where they follow some dispatch from the utility and get maybe a bill credit or something of that nature, while when we're putting you directly into wholesale markets, essentially get you the revenue that a power plant would get and help provide you that sort of extra stream of income, in addition to some sort of ancillary benefits. We have like a real-time platform where they can literally see their usage and their dispatches in real time, because we have our own sort of telemetry that we use, and it helps them with just their conservation and energy efficiency as well. Because when they have that sort of granular real-time data, it really does help operations folks see what's happening at their facilities or at their big box stores or whatever the entity is. They are very helpful in preventing blackouts and use of peaking power plants, and serve the purpose that I've talked about, that they can really provide all the services that RTOs need, and are particularly helpful when it's time to, you know, before you start doing mandatory load shedding, if you have these other levers to push. They're also helpful for resiliency for those purposes. You know, before you start having rolling blackouts, you know, you can have this, instead of supply flexibility, which I think was the historic paradigm. I think a lot of future thinkers are talking about load flexibility, and that really being a future that a way of looking at intermittency and variability is, rather than trying to rely solely on supply flexibility to deal with those issues, start looking at load flexibility and creating a regulatory and operational construct that can really happen. There's been a lot in the press about, the value that can be there for virtual power plants. So that's just like a small snapshot. And it's inexpensive. It doesn't have the infrastructure cost. I mean, obviously the customer has paid for whatever behind the meter resource they have, whether it's a battery, whether it's a generator, or just them curtailing whatever investment they've made to make that happen. But generally it's not the full regulatory risk and construction risk and all the things, fuel and all the things that go into supply side generation that make it less expensive, less risky, and more immediately available. The barriers to, I'm whipping through it, so there's enough time for questions since we're a little bit behind. The barriers to me they're operational and regulatory, but those are sort of intertwined in that the regulatory construct really needs to be set up to deal with any of the operational issues that have been recognized, but not be so burdensome that you don't realize these benefits. Some of the benefits, there was a big report that Brattle put out called Real Reliability, the Value of Virtual Power, which talked about virtual power plants could be sort of deployed at 40 to 60% if you exclude all the societal benefits, 40 to 60% of the cost of alternative options. And if you did include societal benefits like emissions and all that sort of stuff, it'd be a net negative cost over sort of other resources for resource adequacy. So it's important, I think, to remove barriers or to minimize barriers to those getting into market and being useful, because there are key benefits, particularly with the affordability issues we've talked about and the resiliency issues. It's just an important solution. FERC Order 2222 directed RTOs to remove any barriers to these resources participating in markets. But to be perfectly clear, these resources are there and they're already participating in the markets in many instances. There was nothing sort of excluding them in a lot of markets from participating. And what FERC directed, RTOs and ISOs to do is to make sure that their rules and protocols didn't, represent barriers to these resources participating in markets. And all of these RTOs and ISOs are currently working through compliance with FERC Order 2222. And there are different challenges that are coming up, like what participation model you use, like how they're going to characterize those resources, what rules apply. One of the big challenges that's been coming up in a lot of the compliance filings is FERC said that, they needed to allow for multinodal heterogeneous applications. And what that means is all of these resources are spread across broad geographic areas. So they're not like a power plant where they're interconnecting at a certain point and they're at that node and they're, modeled and dispatched at one location. And so the questions have come up, how do we interconnect those and make sure, and how do we model that for resource adequacy purposes, and what capacity accreditation do we give those, what performance do they have to have, and whether or not supply side constructs really work in that instance. And one of the things that FERC said, and it's as helpful as any guidance you get from an order from an agency, is, treat them the same, except when it makes sense to treat them differently. And that's like the guidance that Mr. Cathey and his poor colleagues have to kind of work with as they try to comply and make this stuff happen, but still keep the grid safe and reliable and transparent. I mean, I think visibility is a big concern as well. Like, you sort of know where the power plant is and what it's dispatching. And do we have like telemetry? Do we have data to see where these resources are, whether they're complying with dispatch instructions and all those sort of things? So it's a lot of regulatory challenges we participate. There's some broad participation. We participate and we have a perspective. Utilities participate and they have a perspective. And the ISOs themselves have perspectives. And the things go back and forth to FERC, who tries to clarify or direct like what they intend to accomplish. They ultimately want the values that Brattle pointed out to come to fruition, to benefit customers, reduce prices, that sort of thing. But there's this sort of near-term challenge of getting the regulatory construct right and making sure it recognizes the operational constraints that are happening there. So that's the challenge for utilities, for aggregators, and for RTO ISO staffs. So it's less expensive. It works well with intermittency and variability. It's a good match. We have graphs. I should have put one in here that shows how well these sort of things match up with these resources when you look at our graphs of our dispatches. And the main issue for us is regulatory progress, that it happens in a timely way, that it's transparent, and that it tries to comply with FERC's directives on these issues. And we're all working through it in fits and starts, but that's where we are as sort of across industries trying to make virtual power plants happen.
The light is green. Here we go. So we've gone from kind of hyper local disaggregated resources that can be pulled together into distributed resources to planning at the utility level, and then the regional planning organization will speak after me. So I'm Jason Humphrey. I'm the Vice President of Generation Development for Evergy, which for us is building new power plants. And I'm going to really try to build on what Kayla talked about this morning and how we integrate renewables into this broader plan that we have for utility to provide energy sufficiency every hour of every day for the next 20 years, which is an interesting problem to solve. So we're going to think about integration of carbon-free and low emissions generation, our preferred resource portfolio, which I did not know Spire was going to be the first to pitch out this morning. The concept of net load, complementary generation profiles. I know we just finished lunch, so we'll get to think about some delicious peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. And then you guys will get to guess which is later. I'll have one of everything on what that means. And I have blanked the presentation. So Evergy is in a unique portion of the SPP marketplace. We have access to actually when you combine wind and solar, some of the best renewable generation profile in the United States. Kansas is the #8 state for solar in the US, and wind is #2 or 3, depending on how you measure. And so we are much further along in the journey to net zero than most investor-owned utilities, and that's mostly geography being destiny in this case. And so in 2023, we had just over 50% of the kilowatt hours generated on our system that were over 50% carbon-free. That's made up of wind and nuclear for the most part, other renewables, which is some solar, some landfill gas, other things, take us the rest of the way. And then the other 50% is fossil. And you'll see if you drill in or double click into that a little bit more, it's mostly coal on an energy basis for us. So we're in this weird bimodal situation where we have a ton of carbon-free kilowatt hours and we have a ton of high carbon intensity kilowatt hours that generally make up our portfolio. But even if we look at just where we are today, since 2005, our transformation is pretty significant. This is a combination of back-end controls on our thermal plants and the incorporation of carbon-free kilowatt hours from namely wind emissions. And so we've had a 53% reduction in CO2, a 98% reduction in sulfur dioxide, and a 90% reduction in NOx since 2005. That's kind of the baseline year almost everybody uses because it ties to the Paris Accord and some other things. I'm going to keep hitting the wrong button here. So this is a really, really blocky view of the next 20 years. I'm going to zoom in and go back to the slide that Spire showed in a little while on what the next immediate 10 years looks like. But you can see a real transformative picture as we look at the far right bar on this graph over that time. So we've got a significant increase in resources and a big decrease in thermal resources, but still a very large net addition. I know it's been said several times today, but I'll reemphasize the point. We are using more energy tomorrow than we are today as a society. Energy efficiency works really well at the hyper local individual level. I think most of us probably use less than we once did at home. We have HD TVs versus the big CRTs that we used to have. But we as a society as a whole continue to use more. Dominion and Southern Power, their largest customers are data centers now, and they are over a gigawatt at a single location for their single customer. And so when we think about a 10 or 11 gigawatt system for Evergy, that would be 10% of the total load for Evergy's 1.7 million customers at a single data center campus. So it's pretty substantial. So we're going to add more resources than we retire when we look at a nameplate capacity view. And when we zoom into the first 10 years of that addition, so taking us out through 2033, we see a very balanced view of the types of sources we intend to add. But most of them, on a nameplate basis, are renewable. So we've got over a gigawatt of wind that will add to our system through 2033, almost 2 gigawatts of solar, and a little more than 2 gigawatts of natural gas. Some in combined cycle mode where we need energy and capacity, and some in simple cycle mode where it's really about firming up those renewables for the time that they aren't there. But in the near term, which is the 27 and 28 year, and the way the IRP math works is that resource is available 1/1 of the year it's represented. So really in 2026 and 2027, we'll be adding over a gigawatt of solar to Evergy's 3 operating utilities that we have, which is Evergy Metro, where we are today, Evergy Missouri West, and Evergy Kansas Central. So significant build out in solar. Solar is kind of an underrepresented resource in the SPP. Right now, we have very little solar online, but if you look at the grid interconnection queue, solar is where the money is, so to speak. We see a lot of solar being added to the system, and Evergy is certainly part of that. So I want to introduce everybody to the concept of net load and just how variable resources are in the SPP. So I took a snapshot just in the last 30 days of what the SPP has experienced from a net load perspective. Net load is the load on the system, reduce out non-controllable resources, which are generally renewables. We can't push a button to tell the sun to shine or the wind to blow. And what you're left over with is what firm dispatchable power has to cover. And so that is the net load concept. And over just the last 30 days in the SPP, this isn't a high load time, this isn't a particularly high renewable resource time of year, we go from a low of 0 megawatt hours required from dispatchable resources, all the way from that low up to a peak of 31 gigawatts retired. And that is just in the last 30 days what we have experienced on the SPP grid. And so for folks like Evergy who have to plan for that 24/7, 365 availability for our customers, we need to be ready to meet load in all of these situations. So while more and more our energy density will be served by renewable resources, things that are carbon free and fueled by the sun or the wind, we do need to be prepared for those situations where none of that is available. And even in a 30-day situation, going from 0 megawatts required to 31 gigawatts required on the grid with the push of a button. Which really gets back to this slide we have here. You see a little bit of all of it. You see some retirements of firm dispatchable, you see some additions of firm dispatchable power. And as we get out further in the future, Kayla talked about some of our hopes on what we think that resource might be with long duration storage or potentially SMR. So I talked about peanut butter and jelly in my opening remarks, and I really like to think of wind and solar being the guts of a peanut butter and jelly sandwich where I can. This graph looks much smaller on the screen after my slides were reformatted, but I am going to try to talk everybody through it. So this is a map of ERCOT in 2020. ERCOT's a nice representative central US marketplace where a lot of renewables are on the system. And you can see the wind generation profile for hour ending 0 through hour ending 24 each day. And you see wind generates a really nice high profile of generation, particularly at night in the central US. And then month over month, you can see, unfortunately, wind's generation profile is the lowest, like in August. So when it's hottest, when energy demand is highest, wind is producing the least. But then you overlay solar on the other side of the graph, and you can see capacity factors for solar peak at July and August when it's brightest, sunniest, and hottest outside. And they're filling in the trough of hours that you would have where wind is not generating. And so when you put this diurnal graph and this diurnal graph together, you get a nice kind of bedrock of renewable generation across a 24-hour period. You do the same thing on the seasonal map, and where solar is strongest, wind is weakest, and across the duration of the year, you get really nice complementary profiles. And so they go together like peanut butter and jelly. And that's really why across a 20-year time horizon, Evergy is building both. So finally, I'll end with the slide that Kayla began with this morning. And you can look at 2005, what our plan looked like and what our system looked like all the way out through 2040, where we have some non-emitting firm dispatchable resources out there. Like Kayla said, we hope that's long duration storage or SMR, or perhaps it's burning hydrogen if we can solve molecule availability. But we don't have a single color across this graph at any point all the way out through 2040. It is later, I will have one of these. On days where the wind is not there, hopefully the sun is shining. On days where neither of them are happening, we can call up and have the nuclear generator go up in power. But we really do plan to have available to our 1.7 million retail electric customers here in this part of the country a variety of options available that meet the resource adequacy requirements that we have, but still get us where we want to be as far as carbon intensity goes, and that's net zero by 2045. Thank you, and I will pass to Casey.
All right, thank you. Let's see, that won't fall. All right, good afternoon. My name is, well, does this work?
Yeah.
This might, I'll just so I can see the next slides. Okay. I don't know how to do this. Put something down and then, yeah, we'll start. Okay. Yeah, so I'm Cathey, Southwest Power Pool, been with SPP just over 18 years. And we've worked on renewable integration for quite some time. So when I was asked to be put on a panel, what do we want to talk about? And so I'm trying to isolate exactly. We could talk about this for days and days and days. There's a lot to talk about. But I always want to level set because not everybody knows who SPP is, but I like to start with a map. I'll go quickly. But we serve over 18 million customers. Southwest Power Pool is a nonprofit regional transmission organization. We have over 120 members. The last probably 5 or 6 years, you've seen an uptick in a number of different sectors. So we represent really, there's clean energy advocates, there's gas pipeline members, there's IOUs, munis. I mean, you basically name it. We have probably some representative of that particular sector within SPP. But that gives you a nice visual. So we go all the way from Texas, New Mexico, parts of Louisiana, all the way up, and we actually have a tie with Saskatchewan Power. So we have at times 100-degree Fahrenheit differential at the exact same time that we're operating with. So it's a massive balancing authority. We have over 800 power plants registered on our market. That does not include all the various Voltus stuff. So if you kind of break that up, that gets into the 2000s. But in terms of traditional generation, it's over 800 power plants. So this is just a nice visual. The green, this really what I would point out is the green. So back in 2009, we've done at least 3, probably 4 wind integration resource renewable integration studies just to see where do we see these breaking points. And back in 2009 was one of the first ones. And I remember having a conversation about all the different scenarios we were going to analyze. And 40% wind penetration was just unheard of. That was the high, we're going to break the system. And that was 15 years ago. Well, now can anybody guess what our wind record is? We made it last year. So wind serving load, what's the percentage? well, we forecasted over 100, but what actually happened? There's a phenomenon that happens. It's less than 100. So anyone throw out? Do it. Yeah, it was close. It was 92 if you include hydro. That was 92 was the renewable. Yeah, no, that's good. It was 89% wind serving load. It happened to be at night. So it happened to be, I think, April of last year. So around this time where loads are a little bit lower, wind is pretty high. So it's kind of going in the shoulder periods. And then that's when you start hitting these renewable records. And it's for 7 hours at a time. It's not just an instantaneous SCADA blip. So we actually have really good wind. Another data point is we've built, looking back on the last 10 years, we've facilitated installing year over year, on average, 2,800 megawatts of installed capacity of wind every year for 10 straight years. And I'll do the quick math for you. That's about 2 to 3 wind turbines being connected to the grid every single day for 10 straight years. So it's a massive amount of wind. We have over 15,000 wind turbines, 33.7 gigawatts of installed wind that we manage. Everybody likes to ask what the state of the queue is, so I have to include this slide. It is the latest and greatest as of last week. It's probably already out of date. We refresh it twice a week. But just some observations. There's some pretty good observations. One is solar being kind of the next frontier. So we still have a decent amount of wind. Where's wind? 18 gigawatts in the queue. I guess I could look at this. 18 gigawatts still in the queue of the wind. But the solar, for the first time, probably a little bit last year, maybe at the beginning of 2023, solar exceeded wind in the queue. So solar is obviously in the money. It's what everybody really wants to build. You can kind of notice the volume of battery storage. That's pretty interesting. That's all 4-hour batteries, every single one of them, and they're all lithium ion based, just similar to what's in your phone. So the chemistry is basically the same across the board. I don't know if y'all know this, but I've toured a couple of batteries. They look kind of like FEMA trailers, and they're just sided and they're modular based. And so that's what that technology is. But that's a significant amount of storage. I mean, even if a fraction of that comes online, let's say 4 or 5 gigawatts, that's going to be really helpful as a tool to balance between all the wind and solar and gas that we have, serving. So thermal, that's an interesting one. So we had probably 2 to 3 gigs in the queue for the last maybe 5 years. As you've heard earlier, there is a need. We're facing kind of an energy crisis here. We're not building fast enough. It's easy to shut down. I say easy. It's easy to turn off power plants, right? You already have that asset. You can get rid of it. It's very difficult to integrate and actually install the necessary renewables to complement the accredited value of, let's say, a coal plant or a gas plant. And so we're at a kind of a crisis right now where not even talking about load growth. If we talk about load, that's a whole nother probably panel. We're talking about load growth. But even without load growth, we don't have enough renewables to compensate for if we start shutting down gas and coal. Obviously, there's political pressures. What I like about my job is I'm fuel type agnostic. So you want to build a coal plant, fine. You want to build nuclear plant, fine. You want to build a bunch of solar, fine. We just have to figure out how to do that and do it reliably. And you can see this is kind of what the market's telling us. So we did see an uptick in gas that is somewhat, I guess, competitive, or at least acknowledging that we have extreme conditions. The last 4 winters, we've had 3 winter storms, Uri, Elliott, and Jerry. So Uri was kind of an extreme condition. We've looked back since 1940. We've done a lot of statistical analysis. We have a meteorologist on staff looking at just kind of the risk profile. Everybody says, okay, Uri is a 1 in 80 storm. Well, okay, two winters later, we had Elliott, and then we had Jerry. So at some point, okay, we may not have a Uri. Hopefully we don't have a Uri all the time, maybe, once every 20, 45, 50 years, but we're certainly already having an Elliott and Jerry. So we're having these extreme conditions. Last August, we exceeded our summer peak by 5% because of a heat dome. So we're seeing these kind of not only load projection challenges and electrification and EV and data center loads and microgrids and hydrolyzers and all these different unconventional loads. we're also seeing the fact that these extreme conditions are happening. It's not just a statistical anomaly. So we have to be able to figure out how to protect it. So I did want to talk about resource adequacy a little bit, and then we could maybe go to questions. Resource adequacy at SPP. So when I joined SPP, we had over 45%, maybe even more. We had a lot of generation online versus the load profile. We performed resource adequacy, but no one really cared. It's just we were flush with generation. No one cared. In fact, the individual still is responsible for that same. We had a nice conversation. No one really cared, but now that we're scarce, everyone, there's cooks in the kitchen. There's the board is involved. The state commissioners are involved. All the load responsibility entities are freaking out because that's a lot of costs. And I mean, it's just everyone is jumping. And this is about maybe the last 4 or 5 years. So it's all of a sudden something that we just did. It was a tariff obligation. We set up the reports and we checked the box and. But now it's super important. And really all the other ISOs and RTOs were part of the Evergy efforts. We've talked internationally. We've talked to South America and South Korea and Britain and Australia. And I mean, everyone is facing these same exact challenges, different profiles, obviously different load profiles, different types of, generation mix, but no one really has figured it out. And so we're kind of trying to borrow best practices, but SPP is quite unique because of the amount of wind we have, the nice solar profiles we have, coupled with kind of a variety of different load profiles we actually have. But I like this analogy. If you're not used to resource adequacy, kind of think about it like you're a manager. What's that Brad Pitt movie where he was a baseball? Moneyball, and it was the real coach. What was his name? Billy Bean. So it's the same kind of thing. So you go in and you're having a failing baseball team, and you only have a certain amount of money, right? You could do the old thing, which that's what I think the older people were doing, and Brad Pitt's character was like, no, we're not going to do the old thing, where you just try to get the star player, right? Well, just like resource adequacy, yeah, okay, fine. It's great to have a resource where every time we fire up, it runs. But the reality is it's going to break. They're going to break their leg. They're going to get tired. They're going to need plan and maintenance. Every resource has their pros and cons. We saw the gas pipeline infrastructure fail in Uri. We see wind last June. Can anyone guess what our lowest wind output on 15,000 wind turbines was last June? 15,000 wind turbines, 33.7 gigawatts of power. Anyone want to throw out a guess of what last June it was? Across 14 states. I mean, we talked about regional diversity, but close. She said 300 megawatts. It was 110 megawatts out of 15,000 wind turbines. So you're Billy Bean and you're in charge of making a standout baseball team, right? Well, you can't put all your eggs in one basket. And I think that was base. I forgot the term, but on base percentage, basically, which is what is the steady. That's what you're trying to do with accreditation. You're trying to identify and send the signals of appropriate accreditation balanced across the regional portfolios so that you're building a baseball team that wins games all the time without having to expend so much money on every single individual, because one of them is going to get hurt and you're going to get caught and you're not going to be able to weather the storm. And the same thing with planning reserve margins. So the whole balance with resource adequacy, this costs people money. That's why there's so much cooks in the kitchen. And that's why the state commissioner is involved and FERC's really concerned, because if we spend all our money on the great stuff, and then we also have to increase our planning reserve margin, our bench strength, then ultimately we're costing everybody money. And that's, so there's this balance of reliability and affordability there. But these are the things that RA, I mean, basically influx of renewable resources. Sometimes the sun doesn't shine. During the winter, it's challenging because you have shorter days, you have lower radiance levels, you have cloud cover, you have snow cover, so solar, but it's awesome during the summer, right? Solar is great during the summer. So you have to have a balanced mix of portfolio. And we, at SPP, we don't have a capacity market. We're also not the resource planner. So we can't just tell everybody this is exactly what you build. We have to basically craft an optimized requirement of policy so that, Evergy can take that and kind of morph to their own business function and their own overall corporate objectives, whatever mix they actually need. But we have a job to do to basically send the right signals, make sure you're not only building wind or you're not only building gas, and then increasing load and volatility. So just to touch on this a little bit, traditionally all the loads are, a typical forecast for Kansas City or Omaha is maybe 0.5% to maybe 1.5%, right? 1.5% 10 years ago was a pretty decent load jump between year to year. Now we're seeing anywhere from 3 to 5% year-over-year load growth. It's astronomical how much load, and I'm not even just talking about the data center AI. You'll hear those buzzwords, but forget that. Just the traditional electrification of what's actually happening, it's tremendous. And then you're reducing margins. I think I'm running out of time, but just want to touch on some of the things. So we're really diving into what's actually causing failures. We have a pretty good approach for wind and solar, which is quite interesting, right? If you look at your personal life and you look at your 10-day weather forecast and you see it's going to rain 4 or 5 days from now, and you're going to, maybe take the kids to the zoo or go on a fishing trip, how much confidence do you have in rain, forecasted 7 days from now? Does anybody, how much confidence? I mean, do you have more confidence when it's 2 days out, right? Yes. And that's exactly the data we're dealing with when we operate. And so when we're talking about long-term signals, we have to do 43, we go back to 1980, and we have all the statistical analysis based on location at the 80-meter mark, whatever data we've actually started capturing since, I think, 1998. And then we extrapolate and do some engineering profiles, and we have to come up with something reasonable where you're running thousands of different simulations on wind and solar to try to come up with what can we reasonably account for in a particular season. Can anyone guess what the accredited wind was on that 110 megawatt day last June? How much did we? It was 5 gigawatts. So 5,000, so 50 times more we were counting. Now the statistical piece of it is, can we count on more of the wind during higher loads, right? Because June 6th is not necessarily the highest load. So we have to be kind of reasonable to wind, reasonable to solar, but that's what makes it difficult. Uri is kind of interesting because the gas, you see the gas pipeline infrastructure. So without going all the details, red is what showed up, is what was available. Blue is the accredited value. So you can see less than half showed up of what was accredited for gas during Uri. And, everybody says, well, what actually failed during these particular storms? There's a number of things that actually failed. But if we would have had, more gas from that particular piece, then that would have been well. Another piece is wind actually came in right at accreditation for Uri for that particular. So, you can look at everything and just kind of back into it. Okay. Last thing, I pulled this yesterday, maybe, but you can pull it up from the spp.org, and this is literally happening right now. As you can see, the wind is this bottom line, so that's our 7-day out forecast, and the load is the top line. You can kind of see we're starting to come out of double hump winter days, but now it's a little bit lower during the valley when everybody goes to sleep. But you can see the wind, right? You can see the wind exceed, and I think we're on. What's today, the 23rd? So we're right about here. So right now, I don't even have to look at the website. I know what's happening. Wind is tanking, and we're firing up all the gas we can. And so that's just a clear indication of literally what's happening right now, that we cannot afford to shut down resources yet until we can get, solar can complement, and batteries can kind of lead us through, but it takes a combination of resources to fill that gap. So, and I think I just erased it. Yeah, this is just a slide for the load growth, but it's showing you summer peaks and winter peaks, and some of this is anomaly, like the pandemic year, kind of obviously dropped, and so that we're sort of recovering from that. But you can kind of see year over year the summer peaks and winter peaks that we're dealing with. It's a lot. So I don't know how much time we have.
We have about 5-10 minutes if we want to do some questions. Before we do questions, can you all join me in thanking them for their presentations? that was a lot of information. We've got 3 questions over here. So he'll go and then you.
So it was on one of the slides that there's 18 gigawatts of stationary batteries in the queue, and they're all 4-hour. The amount of batteries, so I guess people can debate this number, of course, but that are likely to be in electric vehicles in future years, say 2030, 35, whatever, it's a big number. And just how do you factor, of course, right now, well, GM is building the Bolt at the Fairfax plant coming out in 2025. They're already saying it can power your home in emergencies. That's not the same, of course, as interacting with the grid fully, but a lot of vehicles will have this capability. How do you factor that into your planning?
Yeah, as I know Kayla kind of sidestepped the question on EV demand this morning. We have Hayden in the room who spends a lot of time thinking about this very issue. But vehicle to grid is a complex problem to solve that goes all the way down to the individual customer meter. And for a system that's been designed for 100+ years to flow one direction, to ask it to flow back the other direction and do so efficiently and effectively is going to take a lot of investment in the infrastructure. And so we saw that with the Jobs Act and some of the money to go to vehicle to grid integration through that. Folks like Voltus will help figure that out at a large scale, but individually for Evergy, where we have some of the oldest, most aged infrastructure is where we are likely to have this first. Think about folks with the disposable income to do it. That's Brookside, that's Leewood. That's some of the oldest parts of our system that we have at Evergy. So we need to get upgrading those very endpoint, most expensive to touch, most expensive to fix parts of our infrastructure to allow that backfeed to work to the benefit of everybody. If we've got a battery and the customer is willing to hook it up, we as the utility want to use that. That's low cost infrastructure for us, but we do need to kind of build the highway to allow it.
Real quick thought, at least on SPP's perspective, the last few years we've looked at EV growth, and we really look at all of what the charging stations are doing and down to the zip code level to try to predict where additional transmission is necessary as well, not just distribution. But one fun fact, if you looked at SPP's footprint, the transportation of the East and West Coast, basically EV charging during the day, it's not just the residential within SPP and who lives at SPP, it's also you cannot cross SPP without actually charging the vehicles. So it's trying to predict the behavior of actually being in the Midwest and covering that massive geography and being able to prepare for all of the load that's going to happen during the day as well. So.
And you alluded to this, but for us, you know, is more trying to take those large scales and aggregate them together. And there's, you know, the challenges that I pointed out to that is, you know, how does SPP model that and integrate that when it's not, you know, a single location. So, you know, we work on the trying to address that at a larger scale and aggregate it together. And folks are working through the regulatory challenges of how to recognize that and making sure that still they show up when they should and how to accredit them as showing up when they should. And so these are all challenges. We all disagree on the degree to which, you know, how much new technology is required versus how much is data sharing and visibility, how much of it's infrastructure, how much of it is just how you model things. So, you know, those are all the challenges that we're working through. I'm going to apologize to my panel mates. I think that if they put Doritos in your box, they have a moral and maybe even legal obligation to give you breath mints. So I'm going to apologize for that, but that's what we're working through.
Oh, thank you guys for all this great information. I'm curious if you guys could just touch on a little bit how the changing like generation technologies projected for the future, how that really changes the economics, because I feel like it's quite a drastic shift And especially with you know, the more renewable capacity that we're trying, how, you know, like the curves for demand, you have your duck curve during the day where you have a bunch of solar, and how you guys are kind of weighing that. And also with the batteries, are there lifelines for batteries like lithium ion in our phones? Like, do the economics of these things, are they going to change as drastically as the generation technologies themselves?
I'll take a stab at that. It's quite an interesting question. Something that's happening right now in SPP's wholesale energy market are negative pricing. And it's happened probably the last maybe 6 or 7 years, but last year over 10% of all intervals were negative marginal energy costs. So over 800 hours, we had negative MECs, which, you know, is system lambda, whatever you want to call it, if you're talking about market optimization. So what that means is that there are externalities in the market that are being priced in. So production tax credits, investment tax credits, purchase power agreements. You know, the wind itself is zero fuel, incremental fuel, but basically the wind farms themselves are pricing in what they're getting paid for through tax credits. And then that's tanking our energy costs even more. And so when you talk about the overall profile, batteries are another one, right? You know, how do you price energy arbitrage? It's not a power source. So they're trying to probably build in their inefficiencies, round trip losses and so forth. Also trying to maximize revenue. So it's an interesting concept, and it's really wreaking havoc. I mean, you probably give it to an economics professor and try to draw out the PQ curve on some of these negative, you know, all of these different externalities that are just tanking the market, and then give it to someone like Jason and try to figure out how to plan around it with the revenue. So maybe you have another thought, but it's certainly an interesting challenge. And what we're trying to do right now is look at different market mechanisms, because energy is no longer, it's still the number one product that we provide. But at some point, there comes a time where it's not the number one product. You're actually providing more of the ancillary services, the ramping and dispatchability for when the wind, solar, and batteries aren't there. And so, you know, built into our market clearing engine, energy is number one. It's actually a greater than sign. So it force feeds the pricing. I mean, it's built into the engine code. And so the question is, do we need to blow that up? And do we need to say, okay, at some point, basically the cost of energy is going to be near nothing, but we still value, let's say, gas when the wind's not there and the sun's not out. How do we actually formulate the pricing markets to be more reliable? Because right now, I think it's heading in probably the wrong direction.
So Casey and I both lived through the advent of the day ahead market. I was over Westar's gas fleet. Casey was part of the effort at SPP, and was it day 2 of the integrated market? We had a Uri-like event. So I was running $500 megawatt hour liquid fueled engines day 2 of the integrated day ahead market. And so those units look terrible, except when something like Uri or that happens in 2014. And so how we think about that totality of the system, to Casey's point, is good, because we do have to serve customers all the time, not just most of the time, not even 2 nines of reliability. 99% would suck. If you had 10 to 20 minutes every day where your lights didn't come on, that'd be awful. And so it is really planning for that 5, 6 nines of availability that we need to do. And today, I think there are 2 things, and I'll say this with all due respect to SPP, that we can really do to help. 1, build more transmission, help get the wind out of Western Kansas, Western Oklahoma, back to where the load is. And 2, get those market signals figured out. Capacity markets haven't worked very well in other parts of the country. Intellectually, that's a great solution. In practice, that hasn't been. So figuring out what those ancillary products are that drive this 5 nines of reliability will be hugely important.
Yeah, and I think I was at AEP at the beginning. Like, it was 2014 when the integrated market. So I remember, yes, I remember that too. And we're interested in the pricing too, because that's kind of the value we're delivering to customers. And it's a real challenge for the RTOs and ISOs to get the capacity. The capacity has been particularly hard because you're looking so far out. And so, you know, people are bidding into these capacity auctions 3 years ahead of time when they've done, you know, sort of the economic modeling as best they could.
And it's usually based on history, and past is not often prologue, particularly when things are always changing. So, and we're participating even in the ancillary services market, and those are becoming more and more important. I know SVP is working on like ramping products and all these products to get the pricing right to encourage certain resources that do the things they want them to do, to be in the locations they want them to be. And it's very, very complex. And policymakers are in a tough position, you know, having practiced before the Oklahoma Commission for 15 years, like when utilities try to get ahead of these things, it's a complex educational problem to say, this looks expensive today and we're trying to get ahead, as opposed to, you know, this very incremental, which, you know, if you're, you know, no offense to commissioners, but you're elected or appointed politician, you know, being too far ahead is very risky. So you're trying to, you don't want to be the commissioner there when Uri happened, but you also don't want to be the commissioner who approved, you know, all the trillions of dollars of, you know, infrastructure needed to make all these things happen. So it's just, you know, everybody's trying to work together to make these things happen. But I think the more the public understands the complexity of it, the more, I don't want to call it risk, but the more forward thinking and forward acting all these entities can be.
All right, we have time for the one other question.
There are a lot of wind energy projects that are ready to go, but they need to be connected to the transmission grid. Now, recently we hear that transmission lines can be replaced with carbon fiber, which would greatly increase the capacity of those transmission lines and enable the addition of more wind and presumably solar. That, together with more storage, would seem to solve some problems about the meeting the demand. Now, my question is, how well is this change going to get through the regulatory process? And the reason I ask that is because we see in various states that fossil fuel interests are pushing back at the local level wherever they can against wind and solar. And that perhaps could serve to put sluggishness into the regulatory process. So how's it going to go through regulation?
Yeah, well, I don't know if I can directly answer the regulation question. I can say, at least from an SPP perspective, we are trying to embrace all of the various options, all of the grid enhancing technologies, fax devices, flexibility, reconductoring. We have a number of transmission owners, and you kind of have to put yourself in the transmission owner's point of view. These transmission facilities that maybe are 20, 30, 40 years old, some of them are over 60 years old. There's an aging infrastructure. Traditional transmission still wins out in most cases, but it's expensive and it takes a long time to build. So the way SPP is kind of viewing this is, you know, looking at some of these alternative non-transmission solutions, such as batteries, stored energy only assets as transmission assets. We are trying to embrace those, but we can't force. SPP doesn't have the authority to force a transmission owner to take a different technology they're not used to, because it's their assets. So if they're taking on that particular risk, not SPP. But from a regulatory perspective, we are involved in those dockets. We're involved in kind of opining on really the net value of these things, because you're right. We have a lot of wind. I mean, you could probably go out to SPP's website right now and see a multicolored pricing map, which basically is indicative of constant congestion. We have wind on the system and it cannot get to the load. Some of it can, but not all of it. And we're trying to build out transmission. We have 90% of a $4 billion portfolio of transmission that are out of our hands. We've issued notice to constructs. It's supposed to get built. It's just a challenge to get built. So we're working on different alternative solutions that might be viable to extract more value out of these existing resources that are ready to go.
All right, everybody, please join me again thanking this panel. Fantastic. Thank you all very much. Appreciate it.